The morning of November 27th, 1942, began with an unnatural stillness over the frozen steppe. A pale gray sky pressed down on the land like a weight, smothering colors, muting sound, turning every ridge and hollow into a blur of frost and shadow. Thin curls of mist rose from the low valleys, drifting across the broken fields where the first snow had gathered overnight. The cold was sharp, biting, and absolute, cold that penetrated greatcoats and stung exposed skin, cold that stiffened machine oil and slowed breath. It was the kind of cold that soldiers remembered decades later because it marked them, carved itself into memory. In that silence, before the day's violence erupted, a Soviet captain named Pavel Antonenko stood at the edge of shallow trench, his gloved hands wrapped around a pair of binoculars he had warmed inside his coat. The wind brushed snow crystals across the lip of the trench, scraping lightly over the frozen earth. He lowered the field glasses and exhaled slowly, his breath drifting upward like smoke. Before him, stretching from left to right across the horizon, was the faint shimmering outline of German armor assembling behind a distant ridge. He could not yet see the vehicles clearly, but he recognized the unmistakable silhouette of armored formations preparing to advance. Staff cars moving along the rear, infantry being marshaled into columns, the boxy shadows of Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs glinting faintly as the first weak light of the morning touched their hulls. Behind Antonenko, the men of the 316th Rifle Division waited in a tense stillness that came only before decisive battles. They were a formation rebuilt from fragments, veterans pulled from shattered regiments, conscripts hardened by weeks in the line, Siberian riflemen transferred westward, and cadets who had learned discipline before they had learned to shave. They had dug their positions for 2 days in frozen ground that resisted every blow of a shovel. Trenches zigzagged across a low ridge, intersected by narrow communication paths covered with woven branches. Machine gun nests were tucked into shallow gullies, their crews huddled around weapons lubricated with special winter oils. Anti-tank rifles lay beside their operators, wrapped in cloth to keep the barrels from freezing. The division had no illusions about the scale of the coming attack. They knew the Germans were gathering for something large, something decisive. And they knew they were the only unit standing in front of the axis of advance. Farther behind the lines, the division's artillery, 76mm field guns, and a handful of 122mm howitzers, waited in firing pits hacked into frozen soil. Their crews moved like ghosts in the cold, checking fuses, warming breech mechanisms, keeping powder charges dry beneath canvas sheets stiff with frost. Horses stamped and blew clouds of white breath into the air as they waited beside limbers. The artillery officers knew that ammunition was limited. Every shell would have to count. They also knew the mathematics of what approached. The German armored grouping opposite them was not a probing force, but a planned breakthrough formation. Reports from reconnaissance units described dozens of tanks, possibly more. The Germans, confident after months of offensive momentum, believed that a single concentrated armored push could rupture the Soviet line, open the steppe, and drive toward key rail junctions in the rear. For the German officers directing the impending assault, the operation seemed almost routine. The Soviet position, though tenaciously held, was thinly manned. A single rifle division, understrength, fatigued, and undersupplied, stood between their forward elements and the broad expanse of ground beyond. The terrain favored armor, rolling fields, limited forest, no large obstacles. Once the position was broken, the way southward would be open. The staff notes written by Oberst Wilhelm Kramer, the sector's tactical commander, mentioned expected totals of opposition: 2 or 3 anti-tank guns at most. Possibly weak artillery. Rifle infantry in prepared but shallow positions. The assault diagrams assumed minimal resistance. Speed, shock, and concentrated armor would do the work. But as the low sun finally crested the distant hills, casting long shadows across the frost-glazed ground, the German officers noticed something that unsettled them. The Soviet line did not look abandoned. It looked determined, thin but fortified, spread across the ridge in a disciplined pattern. Rifle pits placed at deliberate angles. Machine guns positioned in overlapping fields of fire. Small wooden frames supporting camouflage nets. And in several spots, faint glimmers of glass that might have been binoculars or the optics of anti-tank guns. Kramer dismissed the concern with a curt gesture, but the unease rippled through some of the younger officers. They had heard stories of Soviet divisions that fought with impossible stubbornness, units that held positions long after logic demanded withdrawal, regiments that seemed to regenerate overnight despite casualties. The Soviet command had begun to deploy fresh formations drawn from Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia, troops who fought with a calm ferocity that unnerved even experienced German units. Kramer himself had written dismissively of these tales in earlier reports, but he understood, privately, that morale was shifting. The Germans were still advancing, but the battles were becoming heavier, more punishing, more unpredictable. A thin, low cloud drifted aside, and the rumble began, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the frozen ground. Tanks warming their engines. Panzer IV long-barrel variants, recently issued to frontline regiments. Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault guns positioned in the second echelon. Half-tracks maneuvering into place. German infantry climbing into armored carriers, clutching rifles with fingers wrapped in stiff gloves. The assault would begin in minutes. In the Soviet trench line, Antonenko gave a small nod to the soldier beside him, who tapped a series of signals along the trench. Down the line, officers raised their hands in silent acknowledgement. Machine gun crews loaded belts. Riflemen adjusted their bayonets and tightened their scarves. Mortar teams lit small stoves to warm fuses before extinguishing the flames again. A political officer walked methodically down the trench, placing a hand on the shoulder of each soldier he passed, saying nothing. The division's commander, General Ivan Panfilov, watched from a small observation post. His face was windburned, his coat heavy with frost, but his eyes were sharp. He had seen armored breakthroughs before. He understood the weight of what approached. But he also understood his men, their discipline, their resilience. They would not yield easily. The first shells fell behind the Soviet lines, German artillery marking the range. Snow and earth erupted in fountains of white and brown. Seconds later, a second barrage followed, heavier, longer, a rolling curtain of explosions meant to stun defenders and conceal the movement of advancing armor. The ground shook violently. Frost dislodged from trench walls. Soldiers braced themselves against the concussion waves. When the barrage lifted, momentarily the tanks appeared. Dark shapes cresting the ridge. Dozens of them, their engines growling like distant thunder. Exhaust smoke drifting across the fields. Their tracks cutting into the frozen ground as they spread into attack formation. Behind them marched German infantry, advancing with practiced coordination. Antonenko raised the binoculars again. For a moment, he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. Not fear, but the clarity that comes when a man knows his actions in the next hours will be written into the memories of every soldier beside him. He lowered the glasses, signaled the artillery, and whispered a simple phrase under his breath. The battle had begun. The Soviet 316th Rifle Division had not been meant to stand alone on this stretch of frozen ground. Weeks earlier, it had been assigned to a larger defensive belt meant to slow the German advance long enough for reinforcements from the east to arrive. But the front had shifted unpredictably. German pressure along adjacent sectors had forced neighboring divisions to retreat or redeploy, leaving the 316th occupying a line much wider than any single formation could reasonably defend. Yet in that widening gap between Soviet units, the division held its ground, anchoring the defense on a ridge that overlooked several key road junctions. If this ridge fell, the Germans would possess a natural avenue of advance toward a cluster of rail lines that supplied Soviet forces across the region. Over the previous month, the German command had pushed relentlessly to break the Soviet front before winter fully set in. The memory of the previous winter, when cold, fatigue, and unexpected Soviet counterattacks had shattered entire German formations, hung like a shadow over operational planning. This time, they sought to avoid becoming trapped in heavy defensive fighting as temperatures dropped. They wanted momentum, speed, and decisive action. And the breakthrough plan for late November was to be the final push before winter stalled all movement. Their armored grouping, spearheaded by seasoned Panzer Grenadier regiments, was assembled specifically for this purpose. Reports from German intelligence painted the Soviet forces facing them as exhausted and overstretched. Analysis notes from the German 11th Army suggested that Soviet command was struggling to maintain supply routes due to infrastructural damage and poor weather conditions. Transport convoys had been late, ammunition stocks had dwindled in forward depots, and medical facilities were overwhelmed. German officers believed that the Soviet line, though stubborn, was brittle. One heavy blow at the right point would shatter it. These assessments, based on intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance, created a sense of confidence among the higher-ranking officers. But the assessments failed to account for one crucial element: the character of the soldiers defending the ridge. The 316th Rifle Division, though understrength and battered by continuous fighting, had been forged in some of the harshest conditions of the Eastern campaigns. Many of its veterans had fought in the desperate defense of key cities earlier that year. Others had been part of units destroyed or encircled, surviving only by breaking through enemy lines under cover of darkness. Some had marched hundreds of kilometers in retreat during the autumn, only to turn and fight again without rest. They had learned to fight with limited resources, to use terrain to their advantage, to improvise, and to endure. Above all, they had learned something the Germans still underestimated: the willpower to stand firm even when logic dictated withdrawal. The division's new recruits, fresh-faced Siberians with thick coats and quiet discipline, had been integrated quickly. Though they lacked combat experience, they were physically robust and well accustomed to harsh weather. German officers rarely considered such factors in their assessments, but Soviet commanders understood their value. These recruits, raised in environments where winter was a defining feature of life, were better equipped mentally and physically for the conditions that now gripped the steppe. The 316th's commander, General Ivan Panfilov, had spent days reinforcing the ridge as best he could. He toured the lines personally, inspecting trenches, repositioning machine guns, and encouraging soldiers. He was known for his calm but unwavering demeanor, a leadership style that projected steadiness in the face of overwhelming odds. His staff admired him for his clarity of judgment. His men respected him because he shared their hardships without complaint. As the German armored grouping gathered across the valley, Panfilov understood the stakes with ruthless clarity. If the ridge fell, the Soviet line would collapse in this sector. If the ridge held, it would buy precious time, hours, perhaps even a day, for reinforcements moving along distant roads that were clogged with snow, ice, and refugees fleeing the fighting. Behind the Soviet front, logistical officers worked under brutal conditions to supply the division. Ammunition was transported in sleds pulled by exhausted horses. Medical supplies were delivered in wooden crates strapped to the backs of infantrymen returning from the rear. Fuel for the few remaining trucks was rationed carefully. Every unit had been instructed to conserve shells, grenades, and rifle rounds. The artillery batteries had been given explicit limits: no fire unless absolutely necessary. Every infantry platoon was told to hold its ground unless ordered otherwise, as there was no depth in which to retreat. If they fell back, the entire line risked unraveling. These were the circumstances in which the Soviet division prepared to meet a force that outnumbered it in armor, artillery, and air support. But the 316th possessed advantages invisible to the German officers observing them through binoculars across the valley. They had scouted the terrain meticulously. They had dug firing pits in unexpected angles along the slopes. They had placed anti-tank rifles behind natural folds in the ground, where they would have clear shots at the flanks of advancing armor. They had coordinated with their artillery to create a kill zone in front of the ridge, an area of deadly precision where pre-registered coordinates would allow them to fire without adjustment. German planning, though thorough, contained several blind spots. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, taken before snowfall, had revealed the general layout of Soviet positions but had missed the deeper emplacements constructed later by night. The photographs showed trenches, but not their depth. They showed machine gun nests, but not the overlapping fields of fire. They showed anti-tank obstacles in the open, but not the concealed pits dug beneath brush and nets. The German assessment underestimated not only the material capabilities of the 316th, but also its resilience. In addition, the German armored grouping was divided by subtle but significant doctrinal inconsistencies. Some regiments favored rapid armored thrusts over coordinated infantry support. Others insisted on careful combined arms deployment. These conflicting approaches created minor disagreements among commanders about the best method to break the Soviet line. The plan that emerged was functional but lacked the cohesion required for a flawless breakthrough. It relied heavily on the assumption that Soviet defenders would falter under pressure, a dangerous assumption when facing a division that had already survived encirclement, bombardment, and attrition. German officers anticipated a short engagement. Their calculations suggested that Soviet resistance would crumble within an hour, perhaps less. Once the ridge was taken, their forces would be able to exploit the breakthrough before Soviet reserves could react. Tanks would push southward, infantry would secure the flanks, and artillery would advance to support the next phase. It was a plan built on momentum, not endurance. But across the valley, the Soviet soldiers had no intention of giving ground. Their orders were unambiguous. They were to hold the ridge at all costs. There would be no retreat, no fallback position. They understood the importance of their role, not because it had been told to them in stirring speeches, but because they could see it with their own eyes. Behind them lay the roads leading to the cities and villages where their families lived. Behind them lay the rail lines that carried food, ammunition, and reinforcements to other parts of the front. Behind them lay their homeland. As the German tanks began to move, the ground trembling under their weight, the Soviet soldiers steadied their weapons. Infantryman Grigory Melnikov fingered the bolt of his rifle, feeling the cold metal beneath his glove. Machine gunner Alexei Voronov adjusted the sights on his Maxim, checking the belt one final time. Anti-tank rifle operator Sergei Petrenko scanned the horizon, identifying the moment when the approaching tanks would angle their hulls just enough to expose the weaker side armor. Artillery observers crouched beside telephones, waiting for the precise moment to call and fire. In the hours leading up to the attack, a peculiar calm had settled over the ridge. It was the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from resolve. The Soviet soldiers knew that what approached was larger than anything they had faced in weeks. They knew the Germans believed this would be the decisive blow. But they also knew that if a division must stand alone, then this one would stand until its last strength was spent. As the 1st Panzer IV crested the rise, its long barrel swinging slightly as it adjusted course, a moment of profound clarity swept through both lines. For the Germans, it was the recognition that the attack had begun. For the Soviets, It was the understanding that the moment they had prepared for was finally here. The German breakthrough attempt would not simply be resisted. It would be tested against a division that had been underestimated too many times. A division ready to prove that a single, determined formation could alter the course of an entire sector of the front. The first wave of German armor moved with a deliberate confidence that came from months of offensive success. Engines growled in unison, gears clattered, steel tracks ground frozen earth into powder. Panzer III and Panzer IV long-barrel variants advanced in staggered formation, their turrets oscillating slightly as their crews scanned the ridge ahead for signs of enemy fire. Behind them rolled the Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault guns, their low silhouettes cutting across the field like hardened predators trained for close support. Half-tracks carrying Panzer grenadiers followed at measured distances, infantry ready to dismount the moment resistance stiffened. Above all of them, the early winter sun hung low, casting pale light across the battlefield and revealing the faint sparkle of frost on the hulls of the advancing machines. German officers riding in open hatches surveyed the terrain ahead. Through binoculars, they saw the ridge shaping itself into clearer focus. Shallow trenches, scattered obstacles, the overlay of camouflage netting. But what concerned them more were the absences. There were no large artillery flashes behind the ridge, no visible movement of reserves, no obvious anti-tank gun positions. The landscape appeared deceptively calm, almost static. It was the kind of calm that prompted veteran commanders to suspect danger. But the momentum of the armored push left little room for hesitation. The order to advance had been given, and once such weight was set in motion, stopping at midfield was nearly impossible. As the tanks approached the first marked range line, German artillery shifted its barrage, lifting fire away from the ridge to strike deeper behind Soviet lines. This was supposed to suppress artillery and disrupt reserve movements. But Soviet gunners had spent hours hiding their positions under thick netting and brush, emerging only when absolutely necessary. When the German barrage moved deeper, leaving the forward ridge unmolested, Soviet forward observers knew this was the moment they had waited for. Their telephones crackled faintly as they relayed pre-registered coordinates to their battery commanders. Minutes earlier, the guns had been silent, cold, almost invisible. Now, they awakened with a controlled fury. The first Soviet shells burst in front of the advancing German tanks, sending fountains of earth and snow skyward. The explosions were precise, concentrated in a pattern that anticipated German movement rather than chasing it. The ground between the tanks was churned violently, obscured by clouds of dust and ice. German commanders shouted instructions to adjust formation, but the terrain funneled them naturally toward the narrowing approaches leading up to the ridge. Still, the German armor continued forward with discipline. They had faced artillery before. They expected a few minutes of bombardment, followed by the collapse of the Soviet line. Their experience told them that infantry entrenched on ridges rarely withstood the sheer shock of massed armor pressing toward them. But as they advanced, the artillery shifted again, this time into the tank columns themselves. Shells burst among the moving formations, striking near tracks, glancing off armor, shaking crews inside turrets. A Panzer III ground to a halt, its left track blown loose by a well-placed impact. Another tank jerked violently as a shell burst beneath its belly, flipping it onto its side with a plume of debris. Infantry in half-tracks hunched low, gripping the edges as shrapnel tore through the air. When the first German tank reached 600 meters from the Soviet line, the real test began. The anti-tank rifle crews, lying prone in concealed pits behind patches of dead grass and brush, adjusted their aim. They knew the limitations of their own weapons. Against the thick frontal armor of Panzer IVs, the rifles were nearly useless. But against the thinner side armor, the engine compartments, the vision ports, there, the bullet could penetrate. Their training emphasized patience, and patience was exactly what they exercised now. They waited for the moment when the tanks angled slightly to avoid the shell-torn ground. And when the angle came, the rifles spoke. Sharp cracks of single shots echoed across the field. One Panzer Grenadier officer heard them and felt confusion. These were not machine guns nor artillery. They were smaller, more precise. Suddenly, a Panzer III emitted a flash from its right side, followed by smoke and a burst of steam as a round struck its engine block. Another tank, advancing confidently, suddenly lurched to a stop as its track spun uselessly on one side, disabled by a well-placed shot at the idler wheel. The Germans, expecting no significant anti-tank resistance at this range, found themselves forced to adjust their formation under fire. Yet these were only the beginning. The true Soviet anti-tank capability had not yet revealed itself. Behind the trenches, camouflaged beneath nets weighted with frozen soil, small teams manned 45mm M42 anti-tank guns. Light, fast-firing, and deadly accurate at the short ranges into which the German tanks were now pushing. Their gunners waited for the tanks to close within 500 meters. They checked elevation wheels, wiped frost from sights, and whispered firing instructions. The first gun fired. Its muzzle flash was small but brilliant, a sharp bloom against the gray morning. The armor-piercing shell struck a Panzer IV squarely on its front left side. The tank jolted, its momentum disrupted. Seconds later, a second round from another gun struck the same tank in the turret ring. The turret jammed. Smoke began to seep from the seams. The crew bailed out into the freezing air, stumbling toward the rear as machine gun fire from Soviet positions forced them to take cover. More guns joined in. A strafing line of Soviet shells ripped into the German flank, hitting tanks in mid-turn as they attempted to reposition themselves. The tanks still moving forward accelerated, hoping to close the distance before the lighter Soviet guns could cause more damage. But the battlefield ahead was becoming increasingly hostile. In the trench line, Soviet rifles and machine guns opened fire as German infantry attempted to advance under the cover of armor. Maxim guns rattled steadily, their cooling systems steaming in the cold air. Degtyaryov light machine guns chattered from behind earth mounts. Rifle squads used pre-measure markers to maintain range discipline. Each burst of fire cut through the advancing German infantry, slowing their ability to support the armor ahead. German officers quickly recognized the situation. The breakthrough was not going according to plan. Soviet resistance was far stronger and more coordinated than expected. The air remained filled with the growl of engines, the thud of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the sharp reports of anti-tank rifles. Smoke trailed across the field, curling upward into the sky. The once-ordered German assault now encountered a multi-layered defense constructed with precision and resolve. The second echelon of German armor moved forward to reinforce the first wave. Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault guns repositioned themselves to support infantry advancing toward the Soviet trenches. Their low profiles made them difficult targets, and their guns delivered powerful high-explosive shells that erupted along the ridge. Soviet trenches shook under the bombardment. Frost fell like dust. Earth collapsed into pits. Soviet soldiers pressed against the walls of their trenches, shielding themselves from the concussion. But as soon as the explosions ceased, they rose again, reloading weapons, realigning their positions, scanning the field ahead. On the Soviet left flank, a group of anti-tank gunners managed to hit a Panzer IV from the side as it attempted to maneuver around an obstacle. The tank erupted in flame, sending thick black smoke into the air. Infantry nearby who had been advancing alongside it were forced to drop to the ground as shrapnel scattered around them. The destruction of this tank created a growing bottleneck. Tanks behind it swerved to avoid the burning wreckage, exposing their vulnerable sides to other anti-tank guns waiting in silence. German officers attempted to restore order through hand signals and shouted commands, but the field was becoming increasingly chaotic. Smoke reduced visibility. Trenches and shell craters distorted the landscape. Communication between armored units and infantry began to break down. The carefully planned assault formation was dissolving under the weight of unexpected resistance. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery crews worked with mechanical precision. They fired, adjusted, and fired again. Each gun was crewed by men trained not only to operate their weapons, but also to endure the exhaustion that came from hours of continuous firing. Their shells continued to fall with increasing accuracy onto German units attempting to reorganize. Horses stamped nervously behind the gun pits, reacting to the thunderous noise. Officers moved quickly among their crews, managing ammunition and coordinating fire. By mid-morning, the battlefield had transformed from a field of frost-tipped grass into a churning mass of smoke, fire, and shattered steel. Tanks burned along the approaches to the ridge. Infantry lay scattered in the open, taking cover behind wreckage or shallow depressions. And yet, the German assault did not halt. The officers of the Panzer Grenadier regiments were determined to salvage momentum. They urged their men forward, hoping to reach the Soviet trenches where close combat might break the line. But the Soviet defenders were equally determined. They had not yet committed their reserve platoons. They still held several anti-tank guns in concealment. They still had ammunition, though supplies were dwindling. And above all, they held the advantage of terrain. The ridge gave them sight lines, cover, and firing angles that multiplied the effect of their limited firepower. What had begun as a confident German breakthrough attempt was shifting decisively into a grinding, punishing contest of attrition, one that the Germans had not planned for and could not easily escape. The battle was entering its most brutal phase. The climax of the battle came not with a single moment, but with a convergence of pressure, exhaustion, and relentless fire that gradually pushed the German assault to the edge of collapse. What had begun as a confident thrust now resembled a chaotic struggle against time, terrain, and an enemy whose determination had been fatally underestimated. The rolling thunder of engines merged with the cadence of rifle fire, the crash of artillery, and the sharp metallic shriek of ricochets. Smoke rose in thick, swirling columns, drifting across the field in a slow, suffocating blanket that obscured movement and warped the silhouettes of machines and men. By midday, the one straight German attack had fractured into scattered clusters of tanks and infantry fighting to maintain cohesion. The armored spearhead, meant to pierce the Soviet line with speed and precision, found itself funneled between burning wrecks and the uneven, shell-torn terrain. The lead Panzer units, pressing toward the ridge, struggled to maintain formation as anti-tank fire continued to strike from unexpected angles. Tanks that once advanced in tight formation now maneuvered like separate, desperate animals, each seeking cover where none existed. On the Soviet side, the defenders operated with increasingly strained efficiency. Their trenches had absorbed multiple bombardments. Snow, dirt, and debris coated the soldiers' faces. The recoil of rifles and machine guns had numbed their shoulders. But they held, and they continued to fire with a disciplined clarity that belied their fatigue. Anti-tank riflemen, operating dangerously close to advancing armor, darted between shallow pits, each movement calculated to take advantage of brief terrain folds and smoke cover. They fired at exposed tracks, idler wheels, and ventilation grills, exploiting every mechanical vulnerability. One team managed to immobilize a Panzer III that had attempted to swing toward the Soviet left flank. Another rifleman hit a Panzer IV side armor at just the right angle to penetrate the compartment near the transmission, causing the tank to halt abruptly, smoke pouring from its vents. Though the anti-tank rifles could not consistently destroy the heavier tanks, the cumulative effect was devastating. Dozens of German vehicles found themselves stranded, their mobility crippled. Immobilized tanks blocked the advance of those behind them, creating bottlenecks in the attack lanes where Soviet artillery could focus its fire with increasing accuracy. Behind the trenches, Soviet anti-tank gun crews worked at breakneck speed. Their positions, exposed by hours of firing, were now deliberately targeted by German assault guns. High explosive shells exploded around the gun pits, showering the crews with earth, snow, and splintered wood. Yet each surviving crew loaded and fired without pause, their hands moving automatically, following practice sequences drilled into them during training. Some guns were abandoned only when their barrels overheated or their crews were killed. Even then, nearby infantry took up the fight with grenades and rifles, refusing to let any gap in the defense remain unchallenged. German Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns advanced to suppress these anti-tank positions, their low silhouettes rumbling steadily across the field. They fired at the ridge with methodical precision, blasting apart trench lines and collapsing earthen walls. Soviet defenders were thrown off their feet by the concussions, scrambling to reoccupy firing positions before the next shell landed. Despite the destruction, the assault guns could not eliminate all the Soviet guns, which continued to exploit every moment of exposed German armor. Each assault gun destroyed cost the Germans valuable firepower and coordination, and each minute spent engaging Soviet defenses allowed more time for ammunition runners to resupply the front, for machine gun barrels to cool, for Soviet officers to reposition their remaining assets. As the German armor struggled on the approaches to the ridge, the infantry attempted to advance through smoke and debris toward the Soviet trenches. But the fields were littered with craters and burning wrecks that offered no cover. Soviet machine guns, positioned on overlapping angles, swept these approaches with relentless precision. The rhythmic, unbroken rattle of Maxim guns echoed across the field, accompanied by the sharper bursts of Degtyaryov light machine guns. German infantry dove into shallow depressions, crawled behind the hulls of wrecked tanks, and attempted to push forward, but every movement exposed them to crossfire. Soviet mortars added to the devastation. Their shells fell in arcing paths onto clusters of German infantry struggling to regroup, scattering them again and again. In one sector, a mortar barrage caught an entire platoon attempting to flank the Soviet right. The explosions hurled bodies through the air, leaving only scattered survivors crawling away through smoke and ash. German officers struggled to maintain cohesion, but the battlefield had become too fragmented, too distorted by fire and destruction to allow clear command and control. On the right flank of the German assault, a group of Panzer IVs attempted to break through the Soviet line with a concentrated rush, hoping speed might succeed where firepower had failed. The tanks accelerated, engines roaring, tracks throwing up mud and snow. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. Their advance surged forward in a unified charge, clearing the burning wreckage that had slowed them earlier. But then the concealed Soviet positions opened fire. 45mm anti-tank guns hidden beneath netting and camouflaged behind frozen brush fired volleys at near point-blank range. The gunners, having conserved their ammunition for this exact moment, unleashed a salvo that tore into the advancing tanks. One Panzer IV took a shell directly in its frontal plate, shuddering under the impact before catching fire. Another took a hit to the side of its turret, disabling its rotation. A third tank was struck beneath the hull, the explosion flipping it onto its side. The charge collapsed in seconds as surviving tanks veered off course, colliding with wrecks or retreating behind smoke. Amid this chaos, German artillery attempted to salvage the assault by pounding the ridge with heavy fire. Shells exploded along the Soviet line, sending waves of earth and snow into the air. Entire sections of trench collapsed, burying soldiers beneath debris. The roar of explosions drowned out all other sounds, and for a moment, visibility dropped to almost nothing as smoke and dust filled the air. Soviet units in the most heavily struck sectors suffered severe casualties, and officers fought to re-establish order amid the devastation. Yet the German artillery could not maintain its pace indefinitely. Ammunition wagons struggled through icy, shell-torn ground to resupply forward batteries. Communication lines, repeatedly severed by explosions, hindered coordination. The barrage, though powerful, lacked sustained precision. As the smoke thinned, the German infantry once again attempted to push forward, only to face renewed resistance from Soviet survivors who emerged from collapsed trenches to reoccupy firing positions. Burned, exhausted, and diminished in numbers, they still held the ridge. German frustration grew as hour after hour passed. The assault, designed to break the Soviet lines swiftly, was instead becoming a grueling test of endurance. Tank guns glowed faintly from repeated firing. Engines overheated. Tracks slipped on frozen ground, churned into slush by artillery. Infantry morale faltered as they watched tank after tank burn on the approaches. Officers struggled to rally their men, but the psychological effect of the stalled assault weighed heavily. Every minute spent failing to advance eroded confidence. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders were pushed to their limits. Ammunition was nearly depleted in several sectors. Machine gun barrels were dangerously overheated. Artillery crews were down to their last reserve of shells. Casualties mounted in every trench. But the soldiers fought with a grim tenacity fueled by necessity. They understood with unshakable clarity what retreat would mean, not only for their division, but for the entire Soviet line. The ridge was the anchor. If it broke, everything behind it would unravel. In the late afternoon, the Germans launched one final concentrated push. Their remaining armor gathered for a last desperate attempt to breach the Soviet position before daylight faded. Sturmgeschütz assault guns moved forward to suppress the trenches. Panzer IVs aligned their formation for a direct assault up the central sector, hoping to create a gap wide enough for infantry to exploit. They advanced into a wall of fire. Soviet artillery, down to its last shells, unleashed a final barrage onto the approaching armor. The earth shook violently. Smoke billowed upward. Shells struck tanks with devastating force. One by one, the lead vehicles were hit, immobilized, or set ablaze. The assault stalled. Infantry attempting to follow were cut down by machine gun fire. German officers realized the truth as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen field. The breakthrough had failed, not due to lack of effort or planning, but because a single Soviet division, underestimated and isolated, had refused to yield. The ridge remained in Soviet hands, and the German offensive, once full of momentum, lay broken before it. When darkness finally settled over the battlefield, it came not as a sudden descent, but as a slow, heavy dimming, the kind that folds itself gradually into the contours of land and sky. The smoke rising from burned-out tanks mixed with the early winter twilight, creating a haze through which the last traces of sunlight flickered weakly. The wind, no longer drowned out by engines and explosions, returned with a low, mournful sound, stirring loose snow across craters and shattered earth. The ridge, battered and scarred by a full day of combat, stood as a dark silhouette against the fading light, unchanged in outline, but forever altered in meaning. The German armored grouping had withdrawn in fragments, leaving behind a field littered with wreckage that glowed faintly from the embers of still-burning hulls. Panzer IVs lay immobilized in shallow depressions carved by artillery, their steel plates warped and blackened. Sturmgeschütz assault guns leaned at awkward angles, tracks broken, hatches torn open. German infantry, scattered and exhausted, retreated through smoke and drifting snow toward their original positions. Some limped, some were carried, Some moved in dazed silence, shaken not only by physical loss, but by the recognition that momentum, so central to German offensive doctrine, had been stopped cold by a force they had believed too weak to matter. For the Soviet soldiers on the ridge, the aftermath brought neither triumph nor celebration. It brought silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that settles only after extreme violence. Their trenches were filled with debris, splintered logs, collapsed earthen walls, cartridge casings, frozen blood. Men sat or lay where they had fought, too drained to speak, their bodies stiff from cold and recoil, their senses still ringing with the echo of explosions. Some pressed their backs against the frozen soil and stared upward into the darkening sky, where the faintest stars appeared through veils of drifting smoke. Others moved mechanically, checking weapons, inspecting positions, reloading belts and magazines by instinct rather than need. Officers walked slowly along the line, counting losses, repositioning the few functioning weapons, preparing for the possibility, however slim, that the Germans might attempt a renewed assault at dawn. But even they sensed that the danger had passed. The ridge still stood, and because it stood, the line behind it remained intact. Reinforcements, delayed by ice and distance, were at last approaching from the east. The 316th Rifle Division had held long enough. In a shallow artillery pit behind the main line, Soviet gunners rested beside their guns, the barrels still warm from the final barrage. Horses stood tethered nearby, their breaths forming white clouds in the cold air. The artillery officers reviewed the day's firing logs, marking rounds expended, estimating what meager supplies remained. Their expressions bore the weight of both exhaustion and the quiet knowledge that their guns, so few, so limited, had done the work of an entire regiment. The battlefield bore the evidence of their accuracy. Smoldering craters in the paths of advancing armor, shattered tracks, overturned hulls. Farther down the ridge, stretcher-bearers moved among the wounded, lifting them from collapsed trenches and frozen ground. Some were carried to makeshift shelters built from tarpaulins and branches, where medics worked by lantern light. The flickering glow cast shadows across bandaged faces, trembling hands, uniforms stiff with frost. Supplies were scarce, morphine limited, dressings improvised. But every wounded soldier tended to was proof that the line had not broken, that the sacrifice had not been in vain. The night deepened, and with it came the cold. The temperature dropped sharply, freezing puddles formed by melted snow, stiffening torn fabric and twisted metal. Fires started by shells burned low, then guttered out, leaving only the faint glow of embers beneath blackened hulls. The silence became absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of settling earth or the distant rumble of retreating machines. It was a silence that invited reflection. Reflection on the cost of holding the ridge, on the meaning of victory in a war measured not by territory gained but by time bought, by days held, by lines that refused to move. German officers in their forward command posts studied maps under dim lanterns, tracing the routes of the failed assault. Reports came in slowly. Tanks lost, crews missing, infantry casualties higher than expected. The magnitude of the failure became clear with each new dispatch. What had been intended as a decisive breakthrough had turned into a costly stalemate. They searched for explanations. Terrain misjudged, resistance underestimated, coordination insufficient. But the underlying truth was simpler and more unsettling. A single Soviet division, outnumbered, under-equipped, and partially encircled by circumstance, had fought with a resilience that broke the momentum of a mechanized force built for rapid victory. German doctrine had long emphasized the power of armored shock, the ability of tanks to pierce lines that infantry alone could not. But on this ridge, steel had met will, and will had held. The idea that a division, so lightly supported, could destroy the spearhead of a major assault strained comprehension. It contradicted assumptions about Soviet capacity, training, and morale. It challenged the narrative of German superiority on the Eastern Front. And perhaps most importantly, it hinted at something the German high command feared but seldom admitted. The Red Army was growing stronger, not weaker. Its soldiers were learning. Its tactics were adapting. Its resolve was hardening. As the night continued, the wind shifted, blowing smoke from the battlefield toward the German lines. Officers standing outside their command shelters smelled the faint scent of burned oil and scorched metal. They knew it well. They'd smelled it on other fronts in other failed assaults. It carried with it the memory of battles where confidence had turned to doubt, where progress had slowed, where the illusion of unstoppable advance had cracked. The ridge ahead was now one such place. On the Soviet side, General Panfilov walked the length of the ridge, his heavy coat dusted with frost, his boots crunching lightly over debris. He paused at several points, examining wrecked tanks through the darkness, noting the patterns of destruction, the angles of impact, the positions where his men had held most fiercely. He understood that this battle, like so many on the Eastern Front, would be remembered not for its strategic scope but for its human weight. It was a story of soldiers who fought past exhaustion, past fear, past reason, because the alternative was unthinkable. Near the central sector, he stood beside a machine gun nest that had absorbed the brunt of the German infantry assault. The Maxim gun lay silent now, its barrel blackened from overuse, its cooling jacket dented by shrapnel. The crew beside it sat slumped against the trench wall, their faces pale, their eyes heavy, their gloved hands resting on their laps. They had held until ammunition ran dry, and even then, had remained at their posts until reinforcements arrived. Their discipline had anchored the line. On the far end of the ridge, he stopped beside an anti-tank rifle operator who sat with his weapon across his knees, staring quietly into the darkness. His uniform was torn, his hands raw from the cold, but his posture was steady. He had disabled multiple tanks at close range, firing with precision born not from training alone, but from necessity. Panfilov knew that without men like this, men whose individual actions accumulated into overwhelming resistance, the ridge would not have held. The general turned away and looked out across the battlefield. The pale glimmer of moonlight reflected off the steel surfaces of dozens of destroyed tanks. Their blackened silhouettes stood like monuments to the cost of the day. In the distance, faint sparks flickered where fires still smoldered. The sound of wind swept across the field, carrying with it the quiet of night and the certainty that the battle was over. As dawn approached, the first light of morning revealed the full extent of the destruction. Smoke drifted lazily upward from burned-out hulls. The ground was churned into a frozen wasteland of craters, twisted metal, and shattered equipment. German forces had pulled back beyond the far ridge, leaving behind the wreckage of their ambitions. The Soviet defenders, though gravely diminished, remained in their trenches, still gripping their rifles, still watching for movement on the horizon. When reports finally reached headquarters to the east, they carried a message that spread quickly through the ranks of Soviet command. A single division had held. A single division had stopped the largest breakthrough attempt in the sector. A single division had changed the tempo of the front. For a moment, amid the vast and terrible scale of the war, the actions of the 316th Rifle Division became a symbol of something larger. A reminder that the battle for the Eastern Front was not decided solely by numbers or machines, but by endurance, discipline, and the unyielding will to resist. For the Germans, the battle became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most meticulously planned operation could be undone by an enemy's determination to hold ground. For the Soviets, it became a testament to the power of resilience. And for the men who survived it, the ridge would remain a place etched into memory, not only for its violence, but for the moment it revealed the strength of human resolve. As the sun rose fully, casting long beams of cold light across the devastated landscape. One truth stood clear. The ridge remained in Soviet hands. And because it remained, the front did not collapse. In a war where entire armies could vanish in days, where cities could fall in weeks, and where millions fought across unimaginable distances, one division, isolated, exhausted, underestimated, had held the line and changed the shape of the struggle. Their stand became more than a defense. It became a legacy carved into frozen earth, steel, and the memory of a war that reshaped the world.